Okay, hello everyone, welcome. I am Melissa Stewart from HathiTrust, and I know a lot of people are still joining, but I'm going to do a little bit housekeeping right now before we get started for real, okay? All right, here's a little technology overview. I know that we are probably all more used to using Zoom than we want to be, but I'm going to go over a little bit about the features of Zoom webinar before we get started. So in Zoom webinar, all of you are, your audio and video are muted, and upon entry, and only panelists will be able to be seen and heard during this session. Chat is enabled, so please use the chat, and Q&A is enabled, and closed captioning is enabled. So for chat, if you have any questions for our HathiTrust staff, or for our technical support, we do have University of Michigan Library support team on hand today to help us out. We're really thankful for them for helping us today. So go ahead and type in the chat. We also have Q&A enabled for our panelists. If you want to ask a question, just type that Q&A. I have also enabled the upvote feature. So if you look in the Q&A and your question is already in there and you want to make sure that it gets asked, then you can upvote that question. We do have live transcriptioning today, so just press that live transcription button, and you can also hide the subtitles if you want, or do full and open the subtitle settings. We're on social media. If you're going to tweet about our meeting today, use hashtag HTMM20 and tag us at HathiTrust. And if you don't know, we have a community Slack channel open. There is still time to join, and we have our 2020 member meeting channel in Slack. Please submit a request by emailing feedback@issues.hathitrust.org. We are taking notes, so help us take notes. Staff is taking notes, but if you'd like to add to the notes, we're going to put this link in the chat to a Google Doc where we're taking notes of all the sessions today. All right, and with that, I am going to turn it over to our Board of Governors, Chair Kenning Arlitsch.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the annual HathiTrust member meeting. My name is Kenning Arlitsch. I'm Dean of the Library at Montana State University and Chair of the HathiTrust Board of Governors for 2020. I'm speaking to you from Bozeman, Montana, where we have about 6 inches of fresh snow on the ground this morning. I don't know if you can see out my window here. So, how has your year been? Between the pandemic and its global economic fallout, new episodes of racial injustice across the US, and more tumult than usual for an election that will have repercussions across the world, I think we can agree that 2020 will look best in the rearview mirror. The pandemic has turned our lives upside down, creating personal and professional challenges for all of us, and tragedies for some of us. And we know that it's a long way from being over, and we're all bracing for more difficult conditions that may change how our organizations operate. In addition to financial worries, it's important to acknowledge the impact on our mental and physical health, and the impact for those libraries that are open this fall on frontline workers who operate our buildings and services. As concepts of privilege and equity become ever more prevalent in our worldview, we must acknowledge that frontline workers in many industries, including libraries, do not have the privilege of working from the relatively safe confines of their homes. They're out there, dealing directly with a public that isn't always respecting masking and other safety requirements. It's stressful, and it is taking a toll. And unfortunately, these are often our lowest paid workers. It's during difficult times like these that we look to leadership and decisive moves. HathiTrust has shown that leadership this year. You'll hear more about several developments today, but I'd just like to highlight 2 for the moment. Slide, please. The Emergency Temporary Access Service, or ETAS, is an example of one of such development and such leadership. Early in the pandemic, the HathiTrust team implemented this service, which permits special access to digital versions of physical books held in members' libraries and which were inaccessible due to building closures. 122 member institutions activated ETAS. Between March 31 and October 11, there were over 1.4 million checkouts via ETAS of in-copyright items in HathiTrust, providing access to over 90 million page views in total. The daily average over the entire period of service to date was 7,279 checkouts per day, leading to an average of 465,810 page views per day. Those are astonishing numbers. In addition to its popularity among existing members, ETAS has also helped attract new institutional members today from across the world, new institutional members this year from across the world. So it's helped HathiTrust to grow. ETAS is a great example of quick and decisive action that Mike Furlow and his team took to better serve members and their users. Slide, please. The second item that I'd just like to touch on is the code of conduct that HathiTrust has been developing. Increasing unrest and polarization in our society have made it clear that HathiTrust needs a code of conduct to protect speech and individuals during its meetings. Led by Jennifer Vinopal, a committee has worked quickly this year to establish such a code. And while it's still undergoing legal review and isn't quite ready for release, this was another example where HathiTrust moved quickly and decisively during a time of challenge. Slide, please. So this brings us to the member meeting itself. HathiTrust was founded by academic libraries that recognized their greatest strength was in collaboration, a type of interdependence that still exists today. Our focus for today's meeting is to establish a shared understanding of library interdependence as it manifests in existing HathiTrust programming and collections and in possible future work together. HathiTrust and attendees will examine how library leaders can help move from individual advocacy to collective action for greater benefit, utilize services and programs across HathiTrust to address ways we can enhance our interdependence, and examine through presentations and discussions what meaningful interdependence across our membership already exists and challenges encountered. Next slide. Here's our agenda for today. In a moment, I'll turn the microphone over to Mike Furlow, Executive Director of HathiTrust. At 2 o'clock, you'll hear more detail from Jennifer Vinopal about the code of conduct and the process she and the task force employed to develop the code. Then we'll have a break at 2:15 Eastern. Slide, please. At 2:30, we'll have a plenary panel on interdependence and crisis that will be moderated by Elaine Westbrooks. The panel will discuss the global health crisis and how it has disrupted education at all levels and the pending economic fallout. Panel participants are leaders from related but distinct fields: libraries and archives, higher education, and philanthropy. Each will be asked to speculate on how the access to and preservation of knowledge will be challenged in coming years and how we can collectively work to address those challenges. Slide 3. Sorry, next slide. Finally, toward the latter end of our agenda, we'll have an update from John Walsh about the HathiTrust Research Center. We'll also have a report from the Program Steering Committee and its working groups. And finally, we'll have a closing statement from Yolanda Cooper, who is the incoming chair of the Board of Governors. Slide. So I'd like to thank the Planning Committee for today's meeting. They've pulled off a terrific agenda for this first ever virtual member meeting. Slide. I'd also like to thank members. Actually, go one past this, Melissa. Thank you. I'd like to thank members of the program steering committee led by Carla Streeb. PSC leads valuable work on infrastructure and metadata strategy, user engagement, the HathiTrust collection, and metadata sharing. Okay, now I need to ask you to go back one slide. Apologies. And then finally, I would like to thank members of the Board of Governors. Normally, we would have them all stand and give a wave, but obviously that's not going to happen today. We do have a change in personnel to announce. John Culshaw has served on the Board of Governors since 2016, and he spent 3 years on the Executive Committee, including serving as chair. John helped develop HathiTrust's current strategic plan and its new fee models. He'll be rotating off the Board of Governors, and on behalf of the board and our members, I'd like to thank him very much for his service and his dedication to HathiTrust. Replacing John will be Claire Stewart, Dean of Libraries at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Welcome, Claire. So thank you for your kind attention, and I'm now going to turn over the microphone to HathiTrust Executive Director, Mike Furlow.
All right, thank you, Kenning. Make sure everyone can hear me. All right. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Depends upon what time zone you're in, of course. Welcome to the 2020 HathiTrust member meeting. The first thing I'd like to do today is say that I'm glad you're here. I hope you've remained safe and healthy and that you've managed to cope with the inordinate amount of bad fortune and collective stress we've endured this year. You know, the pandemic is, of course, a common denominator for all of us. You heard Kenning speak just now about some of the impacts that it's had. I want to acknowledge also some particular challenges for some of you that is maybe more particular to your location. Our colleagues at the American University of Beirut, for example, had already been dealing with a massive economic crisis in Lebanon when an explosion in August destroyed the Beirut harbor and damaged buildings across the city, including the campus. As far as we know, everyone is safe at the libraries, but it is still a terrible tragedy to endure. Australians and Americans have also witnessed some of the most devastating wildfires in history in this past year, with effects extending hundreds and thousands of miles away. And here in the United States, we have a presidential election in 2 weeks that causes many of us to fear for the future. In late May, George Floyd was murdered by a member of the Minneapolis police force. And he was, of course, just one of hundreds or thousands of African Americans and other people of color who've been subject to deadly force and abuse by authorities. There were widespread protests in the US and beyond after that, which gave many of us some glimpse of hope. That has been tempered, though, of course, because it has also helped unleash or led to further vicious examples of deep and abiding racism in the US. So we've all had to find our own sources of strength and reserves this year. And one of the places that I have relied upon this is being able to throw myself into this work. It's not the only place I find the strength, but it is a really important one. And I think I speak for everyone on my team when I say that our ability to support you and your libraries and your students and your faculty, it's made us proud and it's been rewarding for us. And in turn, I've been amazed and awed at the work you've been doing to keep your libraries running smoothly and safely, connect your users with the materials that they need, and support your colleagues and your staff. We are truly privileged to be a part of this profession that's responded with so much care and so much passion to the crises that have struck us. And so again, I'm glad you're here. As you know, we normally meet in person frequently in downtown Rosemont, Illinois, in the heart of the O'Hare flight path. Here are some scenes from last year's meeting. That's not possible, and I'm sorry I can't see you or meet with you personally, if only because I haven't left my house in months. But this is also a way for us to connect through this meeting. And since we can't count on running into each other, we will have to be more deliberate about creating opportunities to do so. The upside of this change, though, is that we can try something different, and we connect with more of you through this forum and share more with you. So this year we have more than doubled our registrations. At last count this morning, we had somewhere around 280, I believe, registrations from 150 different members, and we normally max out in person at around 125. We've also been able to include for the first time a number of friends and partners and guests at this meeting, people with whom we work very closely over the years, and it's a pleasure to be able to welcome you here after years of your welcoming us to your meetings. So In addition, as you know, instead of trying to cram so many short presentations into a single day like we do in person, we're going to stretch out a bit. Next week, we'll have Community Week, during which there will be about a dozen different sessions, many of them presented by you or your colleagues, and many of them focusing on how you're using HathiTrust to support your role, your mission. I want to highlight this one event. We're planning a social hour, hot tea with HathiTrust. That's an opportunity for us to run into each other in the lobby or the coffee shop or the bar or wherever you have your laptop set up. Please try to register for this. Bring your own beverage as appropriate for your time zone. I also want to welcome to this meeting our new members. Since this time last year, we've welcomed 33 brand new members to HathiTrust, including 10 from Canada, 2 from Australia, and the first member from the UK, the University of Oxford. That is an unprecedented level of growth in a single year, and it's fantastic to have you all with us. We've already heard about the theme of this meeting, HathiTrust and Interdependence, and we're going to highlight the results of the network that we've built and the beneficial impact of the work and how it manifests through our programs and services over the next week. We also want to consider the challenges that we face and how we as an organization can confront those. And so I will urge you to park in the back of your mind through this week. What more can libraries accomplish together when they build on collective strengths and make collective investments, even at a moment like this? We've always tried to take the long view, providing access now, but working to develop larger scale solutions for larger scale challenges over a long period of time. We're a member-driven organization created through your collective investments, and our vision and mission closely align with that of your organizations. Our focus is creating common good services for the benefit of all, but we like to think of ourselves as an extension of your library, one that helps you further execute on your own mission and drive your own access preservation services. You contribute to our development in many ways, not only through the funding that you provide, but also in staff time to major programs like copyright review, or staffing our user support desk, or committing titles to our shared print program, or serving even as institutional hosts. And as you know, as Kenning just mentioned, many of you serve in our governance groups as well. I want to thank 4 members, the Universities of Michigan, Indiana University, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and California Digital Library, who all serve as institutional hosts of our organization or some of our services. They operate these on behalf of the full membership, on behalf, and they make in-kind contributions while they're doing so. And this is necessary, it's important, and it's critical to all of our success. There is a real power that comes from organizing ourselves this way and in stewarding a collection like this. By aggregating 17 million volumes, we have the basis to tackle significant and long-standing challenges, and we can do this together for the good of the whole. We have a portfolio of activity that goes beyond simply the digital library and our core preservation and access services. For example, through the copyright review program, we've reviewed over the last 10 years nearly 900,000 works and determined more than half of those to be in the public domain. Your staff contributed their time to do that work. The HathiTrust Research Center has given us and you and your users an opportunity to use computational tools and skills on the 17 million item corpus. And the Shared Print program is giving us an opportunity to try to move from digital preservation to services that can ensure the collective management and preservation of the print record. These were opportunities, but this is not opportunism, right? This is about our responsibility. The size of the collection and the extent of our partnerships position us to address challenges such as these, and there are others I want to talk about with you today. So the public health emergency that was spawned by COVID-19 has reinforced something that we all knew, and that's that your individual good health and your individual fate is deeply connected to that of your neighbors and your colleagues. That's true in public health, and it's always been true in libraries who have recognized that interdependence and acting collaboratively gives us the power to improve outcomes across the board. So this is in part what Roger Schoenfeld meant earlier this year when he wrote that library digitization has found its moment. He noted that through significant vision and foresight and a long history of cumulative investments and long histories of commitments to digitization and digital preservation, libraries had, through the HathiTrust organization, prepared for the moment when we all shut down. We'd arrived at that just in case moment. And so it was necessary that we launched the Emergency Temporary Access Service, which around the house we call ETAS. This has been the single most important thing I think we've ever done at HathiTrust. It's provided thousands of individuals with access to your library's collections when you had to do the unthinkable thing and shut your doors. And as many of you began to reopen your doors, but have to limit entry for the safety of your staff and your users, it has continued to connect your users with what they need. This service was made possible by very quick work by the HathiTrust team, and I thank them for that month, and the staff at the University of Michigan Library's Information Technology Division, and I thank them for that month. We had deep support from the university's leadership as well to help us move this program forward quickly. We'd always expected that we might need to open this collection in a crisis, but we hadn't had to do so yet. But we had pieces of software and we had significant amounts of data that we could put into action quickly. We benefited from long-time stewardship of metadata assets, including the print holdings data that we ask you to submit to us regularly. We've been analyzing these for more than a decade to understand the overlap between your collection and ours. We've used that for shared print programs, we've used it for collection access, and we've used it for our budgeting. This time we could use it for providing emergency access. We already knew what was on your shelf when and what matched, so we could make this happen very quickly. Kenning, as he mentioned, we moved very quickly. We had 118 different libraries using this service at the end of our first week. And after a quick launch, we had been working to offer more information, more services, more support, including usage reports, detailed guidance on making the collection discoverable, and others that are coming. You know, it's not too crazy to say that we were building the plane while flying it. That's a nice cliche, but it was also the fact that we were designing it while we were building it at the same time. And to make this happen, we had to drop everything else, except for everything that we were surreptitiously carrying out of our offices to bring home to our new so-called temporary workspaces. There were many things that we had planned to do this year that we had to push off, just like you. We're still catching up on some of these. Some of them are still deferred. I'm sure that's true for you as well. But I want to talk to you about what's important and what we will be doing. What really matters is what this has done for the people out there, right? We've seen many of you have contacted us with user stories. We've seen it on social media. We've seen news of people completing their dissertations and finishing their books or taught their classes with HathiTrust during lockdown. What's been great is seeing people spread word of mouth, you know, do the word of mouth thing about ETAS on Twitter. We always see suggestions for improvement, and some of these are often stated generously, a few are not. We have been watching usage since the launch. Kenning reeled some of these numbers off for you earlier. What I find really interesting here is that the average number of checkouts per user has remained consistent throughout this whole time. It has been 2.2 checkouts per user since about May. And that's been true even though usage has been climbing through this whole period. You can go to the next slide. In the spring, we were just ramping up and people were scrambling and traffic was across the board down on many platforms during this period. During the summer, usage picked up and people were starting to do their research, but in September, we have both instructional and research use happening. And at this point, we think that ETAS frequently accounts for about a quarter of our daily page views, depending upon the day of the week. Then when we look at what has been used through this service by date, we learn some other things that are really interesting. This next chart will show you books that are published between 1925 and 1987 and the prevalence of their use. And just to break this down for you very quickly, books published from 1925 to 1987 are in copyright in the United States. They're 2/3 of this collection, but they account for less than half of the usage of the emergency service. But the works from the past 32 years from 1988 to 2020 are 1/3 of that collection of books, but they account for more than half, about 52%, 53% of the usage. And 21st century titles, while few in number, are in fact the most heavily used items in the collection. Or among those, they're not the most, but actually 12 of the top 20 titles accessed in ETAS were published in the last 20 years. So let me amend that statement. What this is suggesting to me is that the historical legacy collection of HathiTrust is a valuable resource, but that you and your users are keen to find ebooks for contemporary works as well, or at least more recent books. And it seems possible that many of these from the last 3 decades are not being found in vendor ebook packages. We definitely need to do more research and dive in more closely and collect data on licensing of titles and compare it to usage, but that's another research project for another day. Instead, what I'd like to do is talk about what we're going to be doing next this coming year for you. And looking ahead, we know that this virus isn't going anywhere. We will have a vaccine, but that virus will be with us for the rest of our lives, even as we continue to manage it more effectively. In the near term, we're going to be living with significant disruptions through all of 2021, and it's possible into 2022. I'm not wishing that on us, but we need to prepare. And so our top service priority will be to continue providing support for teaching, research, and learning at our member institutions at your schools during this pandemic. We'll do that through ETAS, and we'll do it through other related services that we can develop that will improve access. We don't have any plans to discontinue availability of this service. Our intention is to continue to make it available to you when you have a significant disruption to collection access because of an emergency like the pandemic. And we're ready to hear from any of you today, tomorrow, next week, next month, who will need to reactivate emergency access or because of changing circumstances in your community. Now, before I leave this subject of ETAS, I want to share another insight into its usage, and that is what titles have been most heavily used. You can ask this question in a couple of different ways. There's a lot of similarities between the ways you can count. You can count the number of checkouts, and you can count the number of users. And when we look at that, in fact, the top 20 titles on both of those lists share 13 titles in common. You'll see some of these pasted into the chat window now. This is a fascinating list because it's driven by the moment that we're living through. It's clear that some of these are standard assignments in undergraduate and graduate courses, but we also see readers consulting a history of the 1918 influenza pandemic, and you really cannot overlook the prevalence of titles here that are related to systemic racial injustice, its history, its societal effects, its human effects, and looking for tools to combat those. So I want to talk about advancing equity through HathiTrust. Because this is an international audience, I want to first acknowledge that what I have to say is grounded in a particular historical experience. I'm a white American, so are the 11 staff members that report to me directly in HathiTrust. All of the current members of our governing board represent US institutions. My whiteness is important here, as so is the Americanness, right? Systemic racism has a particular history in the US that's rooted in the genocide of natives and enslavement of Africans. Some of that history is shared with other countries, but in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, there are different specific historical events that have shaped the present, different ways that peoples have been affected by it, and that's true in other locations as well. So inevitably, when I'm talking about HathiTrust today and our work to advance equity and justice, I'm rooted in my identity and the history that's created my present, and we will need to do more work with you to understand how this varies across our membership. Now, in July, we wrote to you from the board that to acknowledge that HathiTrust exists in very complex systems of knowledge creation and sharing that are based on power structures that are longstanding, that have shaped where we are today. But acknowledging that, as Elaine Westbrooks has written, we also have to seriously look at those systems, identify them, understand how they're working, and then take action to correct that and remedy them. So I want to make clear here, we're committed to undertaking this work. And when we wrote to you in July, we said we would be taking some initial steps. Some of these are on the screen here. And the first one is making this work a long-term priority for the organization. To get moving on this, we also need to focus on our own education, our own training and awareness for the governance, for our staff, to better prepare and help us recognize where structural inequities are extended through our work. What we want to do is center in our day-to-day work and awareness of this and how our decisions and how our requirements can inadvertently disadvantage others. I'll talk about a couple of other things up here shortly, including the Statement of Values and Code of Conduct, but we also said in July that we'd come to this meeting with a more complete agenda, which encompassed membership, access policies, collection, and associated metadata. And so I'd like to first start talking about these in order. Before I do, I wanted to address a question. You might ask, why us? Why should HathiTrust go and do this work? And I want to again invoke our responsibility, right? We serve as the steward to what amounts to the largest collection of digitized books in the hands of a nonprofit, right? It's a huge amount of scholarly content, and we're in a position to make changes that can be influential in how and to whom that material is made accessible. This summer, among the staff, the program steering committee, and the board, we talked about some immediate priorities that would help focus on those, help us focus on where we could have more immediate effects. In the interest of time, I'm not going to discuss everything. This is going to be a long-standing objective, but I want to touch on several now that I think will be important to how we operate and how you interact with us. So let me first talk about membership and access. In 2021, we're going to take some time to develop a more deliberate membership strategy that considers equity and access to knowledge. We began in 2008 as the work of about 24 research universities, most of them ARL members, R1 institutions. Then when I joined HathiTrust in 2014, we had grown, our membership had diversified, we had about 90 members, and we now have today over 165 members serving over 220 campuses. This growth has really has been organic. It's been through word of mouth. It's not through hiring a sales team, right? We've not been out there making a lot of cold calls. We're a small group. We've really been focused on what we can get done to support users and you. But as a highly visible program, we had a lot of gravity, and we were seen to be something to be important and something to be a part of. Now, our member criteria, which the membership approved just about a year and a half ago, states that not-for-profit organizations, including universities, colleges, museums, research centers, and agencies that operate one or more libraries could become members of HathiTrust. This still makes sense to us, right? Research libraries are the types of libraries we're best positioned to support. Different types of libraries have different mandates and have different service needs. But speaking of services, there are some types of access to the collection that are tied to membership, right? I mentioned text and data mining earlier through the HathiTrust Research Center. Some of those services are available to our members. There are others as well. And as gratifying as it was this year to be able to provide emergency access to our members, it also spotlighted who did not have that access. We operate in tension among competing principles here. We want to create a public common good for broad benefit. We also need to be able to support you in your libraries more specifically and directly. This is not an uncommon tension in membership organizations. It's one we have to navigate, and it's one we're going to have to be thinking about critically and carefully as we go into the next several years. We've been building this network of interdependence and resilience for over a decade, and going into the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see more serious financial challenges. Many institutions that are already strapped are going to be scrambling, and we have to think carefully about who's going to be able to continue to invest in collective infrastructure, and more importantly, who's going to be able to benefit from it and in what ways. So we've given thought to this over the years. In 2020, we introduced a new tier system into our fees that would help libraries with fewer resources, smaller budgets pay less for membership in HathiTrust. The goal was to share costs more equitably across the membership. We've also more recently joined the Open Athens Federation, which will provide member libraries who employ that service a more cost-effective authentication and identity management service than what we'd previously preferred. But we only have one member that is classified as an historically Black college or university. That's Xavier, who's joined us this year, and thank you for joining us. We really need to know why our membership is that homogenous. Is it because of the cost? Is it because we have done a poor job of outreach? Is it because the services we provide are not perceived to be valuable? Or is it because we've been making assumptions about membership that we believe to be self-evident that are actually not so? So in the coming year, a key priority for us will be to develop a membership recruitment strategy that's rooted in a clearer notion of what membership means, a clearer articulation of the value we bring to different types of libraries, and a better understanding of the barriers we now have in the way of membership. And by extension, that means access to the collection and some services as well. These barriers might be financial, they might be technological, and there might be others, but if we don't take the time to understand what they are, we won't be able to meet potential members where they are. So today it would be premature to set a specific goal and say we're going to try to recruit X number of members from particular sizes or demographics or what have you. That's really not what this is about right now. What I am hoping, though, is through the work of investigating needs, investigating where we are, where we aren't, and why we aren't there, we'll be able to come back with a better understanding of the ways that HathiTrust should grow, can grow, and how that growth can advance equity and access to knowledge. Now, the collection that we steward is the source of strength, and for many of you, it's the most visible and important part of what we do. And if we didn't have that collection, we couldn't tackle the challenges like shared print, for example. But I think it's important for us to think about the scope and the contents of the collection and how it was created and the metadata that describes it and how those extend historical inequities. And then we have to think about what can be done about it. The collection of 17 million volumes reflects decades of collecting choices based on curricula and research and publishing practices over the last 2 centuries. The digital library includes primarily materials drawn from an upper tier of North American research libraries, not exclusively, but largely so because of mass digitization. It's not comprehensive. We know that it contains most, but not everything that was digitized by Google, Internet Archive, Microsoft, and others. We also know that it's only a fraction of the totality of the books that are in your collections or that are out there. You can see here that the number of unique titles in HathiTrust is a portion of what is held by the Big Ten, and that's an even smaller share of what's recorded in WorldCat. We've put substantial effort into building some collections in HathiTrust, including federal documents. But aside from that, we've largely taken an approach that is more reactive and receptive. It originated out of the mass digitization moment. We organized ourselves around that. We optimized our practices and workflows around it. And the collection we know surely underrepresents some things, but we're not sure where and to what degree. It may well be that it underrepresents authors of color who would have had limited or no access to publication channels that led to library acquisition over the decades. But we really need to do more analysis and understand how that may be in play. Now, similarly, our bibliographic metadata aggregates decades of disciplinary and local practice. And we've talked about this a lot. We've talked about the way when you aggregate this many records, you start to magnify and see errors on a large scale. You also see inconsistencies, and you can also see terminology that harmfully describes or misleadingly characterizes people, concepts, and subjects. And this is despite lots of good work that has been done in our libraries. I don't want to slag on our metadata work here. This is a systemic and domain-wide problem. It's just not one that we can fully address on our local campuses. It's not one that we can fully address as HathiTrust, really, without taking on more work with more partners. And I think we can help be an influential partner in this. But there are things that we can do as well to help to remedy some of this. But these are complicated problems we need to get our heads around. And so I'm not going to overpromise here, especially not for the next year. In 2021, I think we'll be working more in a developmental fashion rather than a definitive fashion to advance structural equities in our collections and metadata. In short, we've got more work to do if we're going to on our basic strategies and stewardship issues for collection and metadata assets. If we're going to more clearly consider how the digital library can be a comprehensive and representative collection. The good news is that we do have some work underway that's aimed in this direction. Later today, you'll hear from the Digital Collection Strategy Working Group, which has been tasked with helping to develop a strategy for assessment of the collection, as well as its growth. You'll also hear later today from the Community Metadata Strategy Task Force. One of their primary interests is in considering how HathiTrust can take a more active stewardship role over the quality and the contents of our metadata that we present to our users. We'll need to reorient many of our existing practices and our decisions to be able to do that. We need to recognize we're part of a complex ecosystem of metadata sharing and harvesting. But with clear direction from our colleagues in this working group and from you, we can do a lot more in the management of our metadata and the inclusion of better authority sources that can help address concerns with description and terminology. Now, this is not a one-year project. It's not a 5-year project, right? We've got, organizations like ours and yours work in defined timeframes for planning purposes of a quarter, a month, or several years. We cannot be bounded in that way, right? We have to plan in certain timeframes, but by looking at where we're addressing structural inequities or how we can do so, we cannot be bounded by a calendar. We've got to work together as a community and commit to work on this on the long term if we're even going to chip away at the ways that structural racism has helped shape our history, has shaped higher education and librarianship as well. And we've got many years of work ahead of us. The truth is we're overdue to address a lot of these questions. So we're bringing this forward today so that we can begin to be accountable for this work. We're going to get stuff wrong. Organizations are imperfect. They work within constraints that they can sometimes not easily change. But being accountable means that we have to own those failures or those shortcomings. And it means telling you what we're doing and why and what impact we're trying to have. It means making this a habit and reporting to you regularly about it. And there are many different ways this could be done. And I would definitely appreciate hearing from you about what would be meaningful, how you'd like to track this, how you'd like to contribute to it, and where it needs to be critiqued, why, what do we need to do? We're doing this work because we know that we have a role and responsibility in this community, not just for the generation of interdependence and resilience in our membership in the library community, but in the greater social fabric. And we're recognizing that HathiTrust has a key role to play in advancing equity. It's one of our key values. Now, this time last year, glancing at the clock, we told you that we would be commissioning a task force to develop a statement of values and a code of conduct for HathiTrust. The resulting group, which I'm going to refer to as short as the SVCC task force, the Statement of Values Code of Conduct Task Force, was charged last spring with doing this work, and they got underway in April of this year. And I want to acknowledge now and thank the members of this group. They were asked to do very important and very difficult work, work that required them to work through the pandemic at a very stressful time, and they persevered. They worked with diligence and a great deal of sensitivity. And when we needed to, we worked with them to make some adjustments. Jennifer Venepal will join us shortly to talk about the work of developing the code. But I want to comment on the statement of values first. We have not had a statement of values. We had a mission, a vision, and strategic plan, but we didn't have a carefully or specifically articulated set of principles that we work to uphold. So the task force began by taking an inventory, looking at previous statements about ourselves, and began to outline a series of questions that really were directed at the board, or not the board, but the leadership at the organization, about things that we needed to answer that would reflect upon our values. And when we saw these questions and we talked about it more, we agreed that based on that preliminary work, the leadership of the organization, including me and members of the board, would begin to draft the statement of values. And this was based on a recognition that it's the responsibility of leadership to help give voice to this. But I'm going to come back in a second and talk with you about where we need to include your voices as well. So we do have a draft comment that's ready for you to take a look at, and we're going to present it to you more fully after this meeting. Right now, I just want to introduce this current version through these slides, and then if we have time, I can answer questions about it later on. First, I want to start by acknowledging that we're an organization that operates in the shared interests of libraries and their patrons, and that there are values that we have to foster among all of them. These include first, trust, right? Trust is paramount. It's the basis of our preservation and stewardship mission. We have to have transparency and accountability in the work that we do to have trust. Access to knowledge and open inquiry is also important. We do not preserve these books online for the purpose of just preserving them. We're all about making sure that they can be used for the creation of new knowledge. Equity, diversity, and inclusion help promote justice and create communities that thrive and advance collective knowledge. And as you heard, we're trying to make a strong commitment to developing practices and acts so that we can uphold these. Interdependence is important because it builds resilience and provides us, our organizations, and libraries as a whole with the strength to address problems in a challenging time like right now. And that's our goal through everything that we do, is to help build that resilience in the community. We also need to have constructive and meaningful engagement like this, where we have the benefit to hear from you and your collective expertise. We do this in inclusive environments, and we do it in ways that ensure we can hear from you and the range of perspectives that you have. And then lastly, I want to emphasize leadership, which embodies for us, it needs to be both leadership with conviction and with humility. We have to learn from our failures and learn from the communities that constitute HathiTrust. We have to learn from people who've been doing work before us. We have a broad impact, and we have to use this position to promote necessary changes in the broader disciplinary, scholarly, and social communities in which we work. Now, your library, and your university each have your own values that you articulate in specific ways. So when I say that these are the values of HathiTrust, even in draft form, what does that mean? Does that mean they're the values of the staff or the values of the board? Are they expected to represent the values of each and every one of you, or of individuals? Who's living by these values? So yesterday, the Board of Governors held one of their regular meetings, and we spent a fair amount of time talking about these values and what they mean. And the best way I can answer this question about whose values is to say that these are the principles that will guide those of us who are responsible for operating, managing, advising, and directing HathiTrust, right? I'd argue that in many cases we have already been doing so, but we have not been explicit about it. And once we have completed these and we've finished the drafting of them, they will be the guiding principles for those in the future who are responsible for helping the organization work. Now, I want to be clear that this is not something we want to impose completely by fiat, right? We're still referring to these as a draft statement. Interdependence requires trust, and trust means listening to you. So another thing that we talked about in the Board of Governors yesterday was how do we do that? And so the schedule and the action plan for next steps here are still being worked out. But in short, the plan is that we will make this text available to you for comment. We'll develop methods for you to comment that are other than an email and Google Doc. And once we've completed that work and we've been able to make final revisions, we'll again present them to you. But this time we're going to ask you to ratify them by a vote of the membership, right? Now, given the ways of the world, my guess is that the timing of this is going to have to be in early 2021. You have a lot going on. You got to get ready for your winter term, your spring term. We need to make sure that we are not competing for your attention and that we have sufficient time to work on this. So schedule to be announced, but clearly I want to say, if we're going to commit these as organizational values, we need to hear from you and we want to ask you for your input in them. Now, to wrap up or get close to it, I want to turn to something more prosaic. When we meet in person and we have a full day, we do a full budget presentation. This year, we've elected to produce that formal presentation as a standalone video that we'll send to members when we ask them to approve the 2021 budget. That's going to start, the vote for that is going to start on November 2nd. At that time, actually at the end of next week, we'll plan to share with you a budget memo that will also report on your fees for 2021. So I'm not going to go into that in great detail today, but I want to offer a bit of a forecast. Now, in fact, the financial position of the organization is really strong. Just as we've taken the long view in programs and services, we've done so with our budgets. We have adequate cash on hand to weather not just difficulties, but also to support updates and refreshments to our preservation infrastructure and to focus on new strategic work. Our annual budgets include funding to support recurring costs of running an organization like this. So not just the preservation infrastructure and access services or the people that make it possible, but also more advanced programs like shared print and the research center, which we consider to be central to what we do. We also make sure that our budget always includes funds that we can set aside to life cycle major infrastructure and keep it current and to fund new strategic work in the future. So for example, we began the shared print program using saved funds. We just this past year bought a new storage array out of our infrastructure savings fund, right? We do that through savings. Recommendations from working groups might lead us to use some of these funds to support collection growth or metadata remediation, for example. So we try to keep these costs lower through the hosting of our members. Their in-kind contributions of space and support are deeply important in doing so. But we're all well aware of financial risks facing higher education this year. And so in June, we made a decision to hold our budget, our total expenses and our total allocations to reserves this coming year flat, right? So in 2021, we will be looking for to collect the same amount of money to operate our services as we did in 2020. We didn't really know how this would affect your fees yet, but we knew that if we kept the budget flat, it would have a beneficial impact. Now, it's not that our expenses are exactly the same, right? Services are subject to annual increases. Service providers raise their prices. We've committed to increased funding for some infrastructure services this year. So we're paying for this by eliminating other expenses. One was a no-brainer. We're not traveling, right? We're also probably not going to be meeting in person for a while, so we'll be again online next year. Our fee model is rooted on principles that everyone should pay for the service that benefits everyone, and for those things that benefit a few, those few should pay for those. And it's based partly on an analysis of collections so that you're paying for a portion of the cost associated with the books that you have in your collection that match HathiTrust. And in fact, a few members will see a slight fee increase this year because they've updated data so that their materials can match ETAS more accurately. But this formula that we use to allocate fees has another important feature. When more members join, costs can be spread out across more libraries, and we can keep your annual fees lower. And so in the past, a growing membership has helped us expand services. And this year, though, we've added 30 new members. That's a record, as I said, and we've held the budget flat. So this year, almost every member will see a fee decrease. Not everyone, but almost everyone. In some cases, this will be substantial, right? In some cases, some of you will see fee decreases in the range of double-digit percentages. Now, this is great. I'm really happy about this. I also need to say this is highly unusual. The significant drop in fees is not likely to happen every year. I think our membership will continue to grow next year, perhaps not as rapidly. We will work to keep the costs down. And we know that in order to continue to provide you with support during the pandemic, we'll have to keep reinvesting in HathiTrust. So I'm really glad that in a year of bad news, we've been able to help you maintain continuity of services and that we can offer you some financial relief in our fees. And I want to commit to you that we're going to pay close attention to the financial situation at your libraries. And as we plan our budgets, we'll ensure that we continue to strengthen the interdependence of the organization rather than weaken it. Now, to wrap up, I've spent the last 40 minutes or so talking about HathiTrust's aspirations and responsibilities, how we build interdependence, how we continue to support your students and faculty in the pandemic, and how we intend to advance justice and equity through our work. We work at the intersection of several industries, of course. The upheaval this year is likely to have long-lasting and potentially deep effects in higher education, in libraries and in publishing, and in philanthropy that's important to each of these sectors. So to talk more about that later today, we'll have this panel discussion on the topic of interdependence and crisis. You'll hear from Kathleen Fitzpatrick, Lisa Henschliff, Patricia Sway, and Elaine Westbrooks, who will moderate. That's going to come up in just about half an hour, a little more than that, 2:30. Now, I've said many times this year that I've got to train myself to not say, that's not going to happen. Because while it might not be true that anything can happen, it sure feels like a bad time to place bets against it. It takes effort and strength that I do not always have myself, but I need to urge us all to recognize that this moment of upheaval and conflict is also a moment of possibility for us. Our users' needs changed immediately when our colleges had to adjust how research and teaching is conducted. That's going to have lasting effects. Electronic access may not be 100% preferred, but it is increasingly the only option we can provide to our users. Libraries as a community still have to strengthen the degree of control we can regain or maintain over how access to our collections and research at our institutions will be managed and funded. We need to think carefully about policy implications. Even if as a community we're able to flip research publishing to a wholly open model, we need to consider how to manage and make accessible legacy collections, which are still in heavy demand. Now, this has to be about more than controlled digital lending or licensing or open access, because those are just tools, right? Those are tools that are about helping you do what you do, making research and education possible on your campus. In making that possible, we also help to create a more just and inclusive society through access to both those. We're a network of organizations that support specific constituencies at different campuses, and that's not changing. But we will at times find ourselves in our institutions in competition with each other over the coming years. But we know among ourselves as librarians and in this membership that the future means that we have to rely upon each other even more and build more collective solutions to work across the landscape. So I'm very glad to be partners with you in this. And if we still have time, I'm happy to answer a few questions about this. Thanks a lot.
Mike, we do have a couple of questions in Q&A. First, a observation or maybe an invitation from Boaz talking about metadata. He says this important metadata work can be great to crowdsource member libraries to contribute to. And maybe you have a thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and in fact, of course, all of the metadata that we currently steward for bibliographic data comes from our members, comes from our libraries. It's been through the work of your catalogers that have produced that. Right now, the way we approach the stewarding and management of that metadata means that we ask you to make corrections when corrections are necessary. And that's not easily scalable. And so as Boaz is pointing out here, there are other paths to be able to take in additional metadata to be able to correct it and help us understand where there are things we need to do with it. Crowdsourcing is one option. It's certainly one we've talked about. It's not one we have an immediate plan for. But as I said, as we complete plans for developing metadata strategies, as we complete those strategies and as those help us understand how we need to manage the metadata, we can start looking at what we'll do in that way.
And question coming in, when will we know about those cost savings?
Great. I'm assuming that's about the fees. And so the plan right now is that we will send to our member representatives next Thursday, the 29th, the annual budget memo. And the budget memo, we always, it's about how much money we're collecting, what we're spending it on, gives you some detail on our finances. And we always include a schedule of fees in there. This is a report we send out to the membership because the members approve the budget before we can put it into action. So it should be about a week. I want to remind everybody that because we're a member-driven organization, the budget is in the hands of you to approve, and we really value your participation in that vote. And even though it's going to be at a hectic time, we hope everyone will take part in that.
Okay, we do have time for a few more questions if anyone would like to type them into the chat window. Q&A feature. And if there are no questions, we would be breaking a bit early and taking a 15 to 19 minute break. It might be the cookie break, it might be the coffee break.
No, we're not.
So,
wait.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me.
That's later.
That's later. That's in a little bit. Yeah. All right. One more question coming in from Boaz. Can you speak about the reactions of Hathi partners to ETAS?
Sure. I would say the reactions have been enthusiastic. We heard a lot of thank yous. A lot of folks were really, I don't want to say desperate, but very anxious to find ways to serve their users last spring, because I mean, the hardest thing you can possibly do is try to figure out how you close down a library when we're all about keeping them open. So we had a lot of enthusiastic response immediately out of the gate. We had, within the first few days, just dozens of requests for the service. We've had, over time, really useful suggestions for ways to improve it. We've also, found a lot of value in working with the members this past several months in helping in better understanding your specific situation, right? So I think we've seen just about every variety of reopening plan that there can be right now. And we've worked with you and with each other to try to understand how we can ensure that this collection can still be accessible even when you're reopening. So I feel like everyone has been enthusiastic. I do want to acknowledge not everyone has taken advantage of the service. Not everyone has chosen to do so because either they were in a position to not need it. There have been a couple of campuses that have been fortunate in that way because of the way they've managed their services. And I know for a fact, there are faculty out there who would much rather have a book in the hand than one on the screen. And in many cases, libraries have chosen to make sure that they can find safe ways to deliver print copies to their users rather than use ETAS. And that's perfectly fine because you know your constituency best. I feel like I've heard more from the member community this year than I've ever heard before, and it's been an extraordinary year for that. And I really definitely appreciate both the feedback and the insights into what we can do further to help you.
Another question coming in. Does HathiTrust have an environmental impact value that might mean continuing to meet in ways popularized by the pandemic?
So, I was walking around my house this morning and thinking, what's missing from that value statement? and I thought about Heather Christensen, who works with us, because she has been looking at the environmental impacts of mass digitization and preservation as her own research for a while. And yeah, it occurred to me, yeah, that might be something we would need to talk about. We had not articulated it yet. you know, for better or for worse, we're minimizing our footprint, environmental impact next year because we will not hold a member meeting in person next year. We've already made that commitment. You know, I don't know what the carbon footprint of running Zoom at this scale actually is, but it's got to be less than mining Bitcoins. So I will say that as we put the value statement out for feedback, I would look for suggestions and insight on how, you know, how we can be mindful of this, right? Because it's not just about equity and justice. Equity and justice do play out in the environment, right? There's no doubt about that, right? But there's something else that I think this particular question's aiming at. So.
Looks like there's one more question.
Yeah, let's take that question if we can.
Okay. So if access is based on what a library owns, then by definition, the libraries with smaller budgets and collections will have access to less. ETAS is based on copyright access to one copy, but ultimately you may have smaller community colleges that won't have access to as much as larger libraries. And of course, ILL's reduced availability during this time affects access as well. So.
Yep, that is true, right? And that is definitely true. And it's, you know, I've thought a lot this year about what we can't do, right? I mean, I'm talking a lot about what we've done and what we can do, and I want to celebrate that. But I also think it's important to recognize the use cases that you all have that we haven't been able to support. And interlibrary loan is one of those. There is, as Cliff Lynch has pointed out in a couple of forums, that we're not really in a good position right now, or we haven't yet put ourselves in a position to replicate the kind of existing resource sharing networks we have in the physical world through these digital collection processes like ETAS. And it is something we need to understand better and explore more. I cannot make promises about that, but I do recognize that at a time when people cannot easily get books lent, when there are libraries that usually are net lenders that may be able to have to limit what they can do, that puts a pretty hard strain on the whole community, and we do need to find some more collective solutions for that. I don't have an answer for it right now, but I want you to know it is something I've thought about a lot. So.
Right, it looks like there are more questions, but I know we are going to need to move on, Mike.
Yeah,
so we can capture these and.
I was just going to say, I'll try to answer some of these on the panel, through the panel later on this afternoon after I'm done talking. So.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, all right, I'm still talking.
You're still talking, on to you.
Sorry, so Jennifer Venipal is about to join us. Jennifer is the Associate Dean for Distinctive Collections and Digital Programs at Ohio State University. And as I mentioned previously, she served as the chair of our SVCC task force. I mentioned earlier that we'd also had to make some course corrections after the task force began its work this year, and I want to mention one other of them. We had planned to have a full code of conduct available for this meeting. Kenning showed you the code of conduct earlier. In fact, we can show it right now, I think. That is a short version that is really an interim statement, right? The task force did a fabulous job of completing a code of conduct. The board reviewed that. They had some comments, but they approved the revisions, and it's really just about ready to go. But if I haven't made this clear, right, HathiTrust's administrative host is the University of Michigan. That means legally we are University of Michigan employees. And there's things that we need to do to make sure that our code of conduct is in alignment with the university's policies and the applicable laws. So basically we need, actually it's more than about alignment. We need to make sure we follow the policy and applicable laws. So this is not a matter of disagreement. I want to be clear about that. It's really about clarifying lines of overlap and demarcation between a code of conduct and policies and guidelines that the university has and which we as employees of Michigan have to follow, and then confirm how we'll manage these processes. And we really had thought we could get this done by this meeting, but it turns out a pandemic makes university legal counsel pretty busy. And so our goal is to complete these discussions over the next couple of months, finalize it so that we can have it in place in the early part of next year. So with all of that, let me turn this over to Jennifer, who's going to talk to you more about the work of the task force, and she can answer all of the questions after that.
Yeah, I'm going to answer all of the questions. Thanks, Mike. So you've just heard Mike situate the work of the SVCC task force squarely within the context of the pandemic. I would also, especially today, like to situate our work squarely within the framework of the movement for Black lives. The murder of George Floyd occurred after we began our work. But the struggles against oppression, racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, classism, and on, and in particular, the fight to affirm that Black Lives Matter, were certainly on our minds as we undertook this initiative at the very beginning of the pandemic. We've recently been hearing so many people tell us that the time for well-intentioned words is past. It's time for action. They ask, but what are you going to do? This question is particularly critical for those of us from the dominant culture, for white people like me, and also for primarily white institutions and organizations. The saying and doing go hand in hand, so it's logical and right that we would be simultaneously considering both a statement of values, which states what we believe in or what we stand for, and then also a code of conduct, which is one of the ways that we actualize what we believe in. So putting our values into action, the creation of structure, guidelines, process, in this case, the code of conduct, and a code of conduct committee to review reports of violations, is where the rubber meets the road. It's quite literally how we show that we're not just interested in well-intentioned talk. To combat oppression, we need to identify, interrogate, and then change the structures that are used to uphold that oppression. Codes of conduct are a tool for a community to openly challenge some of the oppressive behaviors that are perpetrated at the individual level. A code of conduct is a tool for a community to say, that is not okay. We will not tolerate that behavior. We promise to do better. As Valerie Aurora and Mary Gardner explain in their book entitled How to Respond to Code of Conduct Reports, quote, the people who need the protection of a code of conduct are usually those with less power or privilege, as more powerful or privileged people are often already protected from most harm. Our own language in the HathiTrust code that we've developed that you can't see yet says, the code is specifically intended to protect those with less power and privilege from abuse by those with more power and privilege. First and foremost, a code of conduct should be an educational tool. People reading it should be able to understand the bounds of acceptable behavior of a community, of our community. Hopefully, this knowledge prevents the bad behavior in the first place. The code should also deter people with bad intent from participating in the community. When that deterrence doesn't happen, the code provides consequences for unacceptable behavior. And finally, through exclusion as the most extreme consequence, the code will keep unsafe people outside the community. So let me tell you a little bit about what the SVCC task force has produced and done. Like many codes of conduct with which you're likely familiar, we include examples of unacceptable behaviors, potential consequences, and we detail how reports of possible violations should be submitted to the Code of Conduct Committee, which will review reports and determine how to resolve them. And you've already seen at the bottom of the screen here, you see our email address, how to get in touch with us. A subset of members of the SVCC task force has volunteered to act as an interim code of conduct committee until one can be nominated, trained, and begin their work. And I'm on that interim code of conduct committee as well. The SVCC task force has recommended to Mike and the board that the initial code of conduct committee members, as well as HathiTrust staff, receive training on handling and responding to reports. Thereafter, as new Code of Conduct committee members cycle onto the committee, old committee members can train new ones in how to handle reports. We have also laid out a draft set of procedures that the Code of Conduct committee would follow in dealing with an incident. The interim Code of Conduct Committee plans to run through potential scenarios to practice handling and responding to incidents. We recognize that this will be an iterative process. As we practice and learn, we may need to make some changes to our internal processes. And we also have a draft process for how to update the Code of Conduct itself in collaboration with the Executive Director and the HathiTrust Board. So you can see that I'm emphasizing here not just the fact that we will have a code of conduct, but the implementation of the code of conduct, because as I mentioned earlier, that we've got good, well-intentioned words and how to put them into action. And that's what this is. A code of conduct is relatively meaningless if you're not actually willing to support it and apply it when the time comes. And we've actually seen an incredible example this week of a situation where the organization likely has some kind of a code of conduct or HR process. And anyway, I won't go on. Maybe that'll come up in the discussion during the break. So to conclude here, while the HathiTrust Code of Conduct is not yet available for the reasons that Mike just explained, I want to situate the work of the SVCC task force and the resulting code within this larger ethos of care and action. Care for others is hardly beneficial if you're not willing to act on it. And action is dangerous without a grounding in values and care. So I'm happy to take questions about this code of conduct that you haven't seen yet, and happy to entertain discussion or questions.
So there is one coming in, Jennifer. I appreciate and support code of conduct. As a newer member, I'm curious, are we coming from an unhealthy place that we are working towards correcting?
That is not my impression at all. Mike can probably answer this question better than anyone else, but I think we're actually coming at this, and this is how Mike and I have been talking about it for, I don't know, almost a year now, that this is a time to be thinking about consolidating what were already kind of implicit values in a lot of the work that HathiTrust has done since its inception, and really think about a code of conduct proactively and in a very positive way. Mike, do you want to say anything about that?
I'll just echo what you said. We to our knowledge, we're not reacting to anything or any event or any instance that we are aware of, right? So let's make that clear. But we did believe that we have a role to play in helping to articulate what is important to us, and it was the time to do it was actually now, and in many ways past. So no, I don't think we're coming from an unhealthy place. I think we want to make sure we stay in a healthy place and become stronger as well. So thanks.
And actually, I'll add that the when I talked about the interim Code of Conduct Committee playing through some scenarios, those are scenarios we will find elsewhere, actually, because we don't have any scenarios that I'm aware of from the HathiTrust community.
We do have time for any more questions that you might have for Jennifer.
I can also say that we didn't build this from scratch. We looked at lots of codes of conduct from various communities, including communities in the library profession and adjacent communities, and also in IT communities. So we will cite other sources when appropriate, because everyone's done such great work. We just wanted to make sure that we were doing something that was tailored to HathiTrust needs.
Okay, I don't see any more questions coming in at the moment, Jennifer. Note here, really appreciate all the great SVCC work. Lots of us would be happy to help as we move forward, I think. That's from
That's great.
Jeff
Thank you, Jeff.
at Duke. Okay, perfect timing. So thank you, Jennifer. Everyone, we have arrived at break for real this time. So we've got 15 minutes to refresh. Please take your time, mingle with your colleagues in the HathiTrust